You're listening to Head Voice, bringing you inside the minds of singers and sound creators who are redefining what it means to make music with the voice. I'm Evan.
And I'm Kayla. And during this episode, we talked to body musician extraordinaire Keith Terry, who founded the nonprofit Crosspulse and the International Body Music Festival. During this episode, we talked about his background in drumming and tap, how he first got into body music, where he draws inspiration from, and how body perk has grown from the 80s to today.
We were really fortunate to have Keith on. The body music scene is a whole nother beast, and we've only scratched the surface of it in this episode. So any references that we made will be found in the show notes as per usual, so you can find out more about what Keith is up to. Also, an ongoing reminder that we are doing a giveaway of a couple stickers and a personal sketch by Kayla, and all you have to do is leave us a review or a rating on iTunes. It takes like 30 seconds and it would really help us out. And last little news thing, we talked about it last week, but if you're going to laugh, we are going to be there as well, so we would like to see you there. We're doing a bunch of cool stuff, so if you're in the LA area, hit us up. And without any further ado, I hope you enjoyed this episode with the radiant and joyful Mr. Keith Terry.
Hello, Keith. We're so happy to have you on Head Voice today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Of course. You're actually our first body percussionist, which is new to us, so this is really awesome. We can't wait to talk to you more about that. So we just kind of wanted to start off and ask about the beginning. So where are you from? Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in Waxahachie, Texas.
Oh.
About 30 miles south of Dallas.
And it kind of seems like you radiate music in all forms. When did music and dance come in for you at a young age, I presume?
Well, music came in very early for me. I've been a drummer all my life. I can't really remember a time when I wasn't drumming. My parents supported that for whatever reasons, and helped me get drums and helped me get lessons and made sure I was in the band in school. And so I started really, really early on with my interest in drums. And then dancing came later. Dancing came through my interest in drumming, and mainly drumming for tap dancers. There's a in the 70s and 80s, I was working a lot with tap dancers, a generation of jazz tap dancers, people like Gregory Hines and Chuck Green, Sandman Sims, Jimmy Slide, the Nicholas Brothers, Charles Honeycombs, Charles Cookie Cook, Steve Condos, that generation of dancers. They've all passed on. But I was fortunate enough to be able to drum for many of them. And I got really, really interested in dancing, and particularly in dancing that created its own soundtrack. And so that's how that began. Many years after my drumming began.
Yeah. So when did the body percussion sort of come into the picture for you?
1978. I was working in a group called the Jazz Tap Ensemble, which was 3 jazz tappers. This is different than Broadway tap. These are jazz tappers, kind of more concentrated on the music side of things, and a piano trio. And I was playing drums in that, and I had this idea for a piece, which, like I said, it came out of the drumming. Had this idea that I could displace everything I was playing on the drums onto my body, and kind of stood up and started playing with this idea. And there were 2 guys, Charles Honeycombs and Charles Cookie Cook, who both took me aside at different times, but basically said the same thing, which was what I was doing reminded them of the ham bone they had done as children, and in vaudeville also. But what I was doing, the rhythms were different, the way it moved was different, and they really encouraged me to pursue it. So I took their advice, and I'm still pursuing it.
Very cool.
When you began to do that, were you able to find other people eventually who were doing what you were doing, or was it kind of you were holding this torch of body percussion and bringing people along with you?
It was kind of isolating for a good while. I did start training other people, like the people in this group, Jazz Tap Ensemble. They liked it, and so they were willing to practice and come along with me on it. But I was creating so many pieces at that point. I realized, within a couple of years, I needed to leave that group and find other people. who could do this art form. So it was a little isolating for several years, and thankfully, I was traveling a lot. I was touring as a drummer, and so I was meeting other body musicians as I was touring around the world, both traditional styles and some contemporary styles. But they were kind of far and few in between in those days.
Yeah.
So since you were kind of, pioneering this genre, this way of expression, what were the kind of influences that you were drawing from, being as they weren't, strictly what exactly you were doing?
Right. Well, I was really drawn to the traditional styles of body music, for which there are so many around the world.
Yeah.
Even though I was doing a contemporary style, and at that point I wasn't finding a lot of people who were engaged in that sort of thing. I was still really fascinated by things like hambone in the United States, or kecak, that vocal chanting that comes from Bali, Indonesia. There's a style called rusu of clapping in the Middle East, the kind of parallel hand clapping where you kind of catch that little pocket of air between your palms. There's Inuit throat singing called katajak up in northeastern Canada. There are these styles of traditional body musics that have existed forever. It's a really old form. And I was drawn to those really early on. Ethiopian armpit music was always one of my favorites.
Wait, tell me more about Ethiopian armpit music real quick.
Well, a friend sent me this recording years ago of Ethiopian armpit music, and the liner notes described it as people were standing in a circle, they were clapping a pulse, and one by one, the person would come into the circle and they would play their armpits. And, we've all heard that sound. We play it as kids and stuff, but the duration of tone and the variety of pitches were like no pits I'd ever heard before. Really, really amazing sounds.
Revolutionary.
And so where I live in Oakland, actually there are many people from Ethiopia who live in my vicinity. So I'm always asking people about Ethiopian armpit music. And the general consensus is that it still exists in the villages, that people in the cities are too sophisticated to do it anymore, but it's still happening in the villages. So, that's a little bit about Ethiopian armpit music. And aside from the traditional styles of body music, I've always been really interested in like circus skills. I've worked with a lot of clowns, creating sound effects and drumming for physical comedians. And comedians in general. I worked with P.D. Kubak for a number of seasons. I'm really drawn to the rhythmic quality of humor, and how that timing and rhythm is everything, about humor. All those kinds of things, I think, really, really kind of fed me and fed this idea of body music as it was growing in me.
Right. I'm also curious, too, were there any sort of vocal musicians that you looked to that sort of had a rhythmic vibe about them, or use some of these elements that you look to as well?
Oh, yeah. I'm strongly attracted to vocalists. But at that time also, Bobby McFerrin lived in San Francisco, and so we ended up doing a lot of collaborations. This is before he moved on to Minneapolis and then to Philadelphia. This is several years ago. So while he was living here, we did some collaborative performances, and I really loved what he was doing then, still do. And found that really inspirational as well. Yeah, there are other kinds of vocal music. Pygmy music from Central Africa I've always really loved. There's a lot of contemporary work as well as traditional styles. I mentioned kecak earlier, that vocal chanting that comes from Bali, Indonesia. I'm really moved by a lot of vocal work around the world.
Yeah.
So,
cool.
So like those genres and styles of music are not something that you just flip on the radio and you hear that. So like,
unfortunately,
so like, exactly. So like, how did you discover this and find that it was something that kind of tickled your fancy in that way?
Well, early on, I was turned on to world music. And world music, it's funny that even the definition of world music has changed over the years. But when I became attracted to world music, it was really about traditional musics, not so much the fusion that world music has come to be known as now. So there was like the Nonsuch Explorer series. There was a wonderful collection of recordings that were happening in the 70s and maybe even as early as the 60s of traditional music from different parts of the world. And I was really drawn to those. And By then I had moved from Texas to New York for a while, and then on to California.
Mm-hmm.
But along the way, I discovered this place called Center for World Music that was based in Berkeley at that time. It's no longer there. It's now in San Diego and kind of operates as in a different way. But at that time, it had the most amazing collection of traditional artists from around the world. It was funded by Sam Scripps of the Scripps family, the Oceanography Institute people. And it was run by Dr. Robert E. Brown. And Bob Brown just had this eye for quality, kind of world-class quality. So we had these master artists from all over the world teaching in Berkeley. And I ended up moving there from New York just to study. And so that gave me access to a lot of the traditional music in that way. But before then, like I mentioned the Nonsuch Explorer series. And in my travels, I would find recordings. I remember I was in Amsterdam, and I found this wonderful recording that was produced by something the equivalent to the Canadian Folk Society of Katachak, Inuit throat singing. And I remember just, bringing it home and devouring it for a couple of months. And then the same thing, I found this wonderful anthology of Aka Pygmy music from Okora Records, a French label, again in my travels in Europe. And so I'd find these treasures and then just kind of devour them when I would get them home. And I think it was through a lot of those kind of serendipitous findings, that I discovered these really wonderful musics.
Yeah. And it seems like too.
This was before the internet, so it was not so easy to do those researches.
Right. You have to go out there and actually find these people
Yeah.
and hear these things in real life,
Exactly.
which is probably better in your case because it's all body percussion, so you need to be up close to it. So, I was gonna say though, we watched a bunch of your videos, and it seems like improvisation is a big part of what you do. How does that sort of come into play, and did improvisation help you sort of develop your own skills and develop songs and different pieces as well?
Absolutely. It's always been a big part of the style that I've been developing. And I think that came out of my studies of drumming, because I was a jazz drummer. And so, the basis of so much of that is improvisation. So it came right through the drums for me.
Yeah.
But it's always been a useful tool for developing compositions, as well as improvising, of being able to develop these compositions. And sometimes they're completely composed, and sometimes they are composed, the architecture is composed, but within that composition, there's room for improvisation. As long as you get from point A to B, you can go any number of ways to that path,
Yeah.
Yeah. And so with the medium that you've chosen, you kind of utilize all different parts of the body, the voice, the hands, feet, elbows, armpits, whatever it is, like you're using all of it. And so we just did an episode with a beatboxer, and that's an interesting thing, because there are always new sounds that are coming about with beatboxing. Do you find that you're evolving your palette of things that you have as you go, or do you find that there's kind of a limit of like tonally what you're able to achieve with the body?
I think the grosser, the bigger sounds are kind of there, but it seems like there's always a new technique that appears somewhere in some part of the world that you thought, I've never thought of that. I've never heard that sound before, and so it's still, there are still new sounds, there's still there to be discovered.
What are some that you have heard in the past few years that excite you?
Well, a lot of vocal techniques, but I've been playing lately with this kind of sound of creating a resonator with my hand, and then using my mouth to control the pitch. So I connect the resonator of my hand with my mouth, and depending if I'm making a large shaped O or a small shaped O, it controls the pitch. And then I'm using the fingers of my other hand, and I'm playing the knuckles of my resonator hand.
That is insanity.
That's very cool.
So, and I don't know how I discovered that. In a moment of waiting for the subway or something, it's like there's just always something else that creates a sound that you hadn't thought of before.
Definitely. And with that too, not only can you obviously play with the sounds of your own body, but then you also have been working with musicians and vocalists and people like beatboxers. So like bringing in these different elements and combining them all in one place is a really neat thing.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that sort of, like when you're working with different musicians, how do you sort of bounce off different ideas and put things together just because you're coming from such different mediums?
Well, I don't have a formula that that I use every time. So I'm always trying different kinds of structures and ways of doing that. But sometimes if I bring new people together, I'll start out with an idea and we'll teach that idea and then ask people to play off that idea or to take that idea and express it in a different way. Take the rhythmic information, but then express it in a different way in their body, that might be more aligned with their techniques that they have developed.
Right.
And that's usually a good starting point because that reveals a lot of new material already right there. And then you just kind of go from there. It's really important to find grooves and material that if you're working with other people, that it resonates with them too, that they're comfortable with that they are, and sometimes it requires leaving that original idea because people aren't comfortable with it for whatever reason. They can't find the feel of what you're looking for. They can't be relaxed with it. So it may turn into something immediately, into something else. That you just kind of follow this idea through, and it will eventually reveal itself what it is.
Totally. And then so this kind of spirit of collaboration and education and everything kind of eventually turned into Crosspulse, which is your nonprofit arts organization. Can you kind of talk about how that came to be?
Well, Crosspulse also came to be around that same period, 78, 79. And it was a result of kind of realizing that there was a lot to be done with body music and kind of needing a structure, not an organization really, but some kind of vehicle to kind of funnel all this through. And at that time, nonprofit arts organizations were very popular, and there was funding for projects and arts projects and socially oriented projects, and it seemed to be the way to go. That was kind of my model with organizations that I had been working with. So I decided to create this nonprofit arts organization, Crosspulse, and it still exists. And so it became that structure, that vehicle that we could kind of run all these projects through. And it's a way of just kind of organizing the infrastructure of being able to produce concerts and workshops and all those sorts of things.
Right. So a big part of that is the International Body Music Festival, which I believe just happened a couple weeks ago. There was one recently in Quebec. So how did that sort of come together and come about too?
Well, I had a fantasy for an International Body Music Festival for a long time because, like I mentioned earlier, I'd been traveling a lot for years and meeting other body musicians, at that time traditional artists as well as more and more as time passed, contemporary artists in different parts of the world. And I had this fantasy, wouldn't it be great to bring these people together because there had never been a festival for this art form. So in 2007, I think it was, I received a Guggenheim Fellowship, and with it came a lot of money. And so I used the money to start the festival. And so 2008 was the first International Body Music Festival. And so we did it here in the Bay Area, and it brought together probably 75 to 80 artists from 10 to 12 different countries. There was a mix of traditional and contemporary artists, and it was a 6-day festival of performances, open mics, lecture demonstrations, workshops, a heavy educational outreach program in schools in Oakland and where we live. And it was just this wonderful gathering of people that, and it took off. And so we've been producing ever since. We're celebrating our 10th year this year, 2018, in July in Ghana as our 10th anniversary festival.
So cool.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've done these full festivals, and then some. We've also started doing some mini fests, and that's what we did last year. We did 3 mini
Right.
festivals in September, October, November, and those were in Brazil, Athens, Greece, and Quebec. So
How have the festivals themselves grown, as well as like how have you seen the community around body music kind of evolve over the decade that you've been doing those festivals?
I've seen a lot of growth, first of all. Not so much in the U.S., but certainly in Canada, all over Europe. Europe is just exploding with body music these days. South America, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, there's a lot of body music going on. Some places in Southeast Asia, there are pockets. I've just seen the numbers of people who are participating in it just grow. It's phenomenal what has happened with the growth during these last 10 years that I've been observing it. And now other people are starting to produce body music festivals. And so it's great. It feels like it's become a thing, that body music has kind of become a thing. You see it in commercials. You see, it's becoming a little more mainstream. Still a small art form compared to a lot of other arts, but certainly considerable growth.
Yeah, and so that you were talking about how it's kind of gaining popularity internationally reminds me of kind of we come from the a cappella vocal music background, and we've noticed from a lot of groups that don't come from the US that I think that there's a little bit more integration and like readiness to like kind of use body music techniques in like in their stuff, and there's kind of a crossover there. What has your intersection been like with like traditionally a cappella music, so to speak, kind of, across the world?
Well, I just in terms of personal experience, I had a group called Slam and All Body Band for a while. And this was an a cappella group that also included beatboxing and body music.
Yeah.
And
it's really cool.
And it was a really cool band, and we did some really fun things with that band. And including intersecting with great groups like Barbatux in Brazil, and doing collaborative works with them, or mixing that group with like a Quechua group from Bali, Indonesia. So slamming has been my main experience in the U.S. for kind of mixing these art forms. And then along the way, I mean, there are other groups like Sovo So there that I have a lot of contact with because I know the people, and so we interact at times. I think I'm saying the same thing that you're saying. It's like I see a lot more body music or body percussion from outside the U.S. in these a cappella groups. There seems to be an openness, or I don't know if it's an openness or an understanding of it or a natural feel for it, but it seems to be a little more open to that exploration of including the body music with the a cappella singing. I don't know why that is. I don't know what causes that situation, but I have noticed it as well.
Yeah, well, interestingly, I'm about to contradict myself immediately by saying, I don't know if you're familiar with, there's I think probably the biggest a cappella group in the States right now is called Pentatonics.
Right.
And they did, I think a couple years ago on one of their Christmas albums, they did a version of White Winter Hymnal that like has a bunch of body music stuff integrated into it. And I thought it was really interesting. It's like, it's one of the few examples of that in American contemporary a cappella stuff, and I think it kind of exploded of like they kind of challenged their fans to do it, and especially younger people I think really took to it, as some, like people did their versions of it like all across the country, and I saw so many videos of like, especially high school and middle school kids doing this stuff, and I think that kind of speaks to the universality of body vocal human music. What have been like the lessons that you've learned from making this type of music for decades and working with people all around the world?
Wow. Well, the lessons, one is it moves people. It really moves people, and sometimes I feel like it's almost like because it's so old, we've been talking a lot about contemporary style body music, but the art form itself, is old as dirt. It's probably,
Right.
it was probably existing before we started making instruments, before we were hollowing logs and stuff. We were probably clapping and stomping and grunting to express our musical ideas, So it's a really old art form. And I think people respond to it as such. It's almost like a genetic or a DNA memory, like on the cellular level. Because I feel like when people see body music, they first of all, they feel like, oh, I can do that. They relate to it so strongly, and it's so visceral, it's so physical, that people are really attracted to it on those numbers, those several levels there. And so that I have seen over and over again, that the accessibility of it, it moves people, and people want to be involved in that. I'm doing a lot of workshop these days with choirs. I'm doing one this weekend with North American high school choirs. So I know there is interest there. I'm still waiting for it to take off in North America or in the U.S. like it has in other places. And I think that it's fertile, and the fact that Main Street groups like Pentatonic, you mentioned, have used it in their recordings. It's around. It's in the air. I feel like it's gonna infiltrate budding more fully at some point.
Yeah, definitely. So something that I think is kind of interesting is in the beatbox community, there's sort of this hurdle that they have to get around in terms of not being considered a completely legitimate form of art. So I'm wondering if you have had to face that, and in that case, like when you're presenting this music to new listeners and a new audience, how do you present it in a way that makes them accept it as a legitimate art form?
I presented it in so many different settings, from, like in jazz and new music, but then there are dance settings, in the folk music settings, from house concerts to big recital halls and civic arts centers. I mean, prisons, there's so many outlets for this. And so in terms of how do you present it so it's accepted as a legitimate art form, I don't worry so much about that. I just try to present it as good as I can get it, and as pure as I can get it. And by pure, I mean just by having an intent behind it that you're going after. You're trying to say something with it. It's not decorative. It's not not as a gimmick so much, but that it's really being incorporated. That's saying something musically, and so. I feel like if you're saying something musically and you're being really honest in the way that you're putting it out there, then people are going to respond to it as such.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, I love that too. It's funny. I just put out an episode today with, again, like I said, a beatboxer, and Chris Solis, and he was just talking about intention the whole time. And I think it's so strongly tied to body music, a cappella, beatboxing, whatever, because it's the purest expression of you that is possible. Right.
It is, and you're the most exposed. It's like you're not hiding behind an instrument. There's nothing between you and an audience. It's all right there. You can't really hide on stage from in doing this kind of work. Because it is so completely exposing. But you were asking, the lessons and I touched on it a little bit, but I feel like people want to connect. And I feel like this work is so physical, it really does connect people. And particularly when you're playing and you're dancing together, I've seen it happen over and over in communities of how it coalesces people in a way that we often don't have opportunities in modern society, because we are so often fragmented. We're either disassociated with other people or sometimes even disassociated with ourselves. And which is the root of the problems of so many, I think, mental problems that we have in society. And I feel like this kind of work, this kind of dancing and moving together, singing together, it puts people in synchronicity. And so much happens when people become in synchronicity. It's a very powerful force that enables all kinds of things to be generated as a result. I feel like it accelerates relationship. If you and I are talking, it's one thing, but if you and I are playing music together, we're snapping, we're clapping, we're singing, we're moving, our synchronicity is going to accelerate our relationship. So that very quickly on, we're going to be able to, if we choose to talk, we can talk about things that are often difficult to talk about, relationships or family or money or, all those kinds of things. And I've noticed this over and over, like when you take a walk with someone, if I really pay attention and kind of go in sync with them, either with stepping with them or breathing with them, the content of that relationship goes deeper. And I think it's this synchronization. And so you can actually kind of impact this synchronization by doing this work together. And it's very powerful.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, that's great. So unfortunately, we're actually nearing the end of our episode today, but we do like to ask all of our guests 2 specific questions. So I'll just ask the first one for you. So the first one is, what trends in body music and vocal music in general do you see and are excited by?
Well, the Europeans are using a lot of recorded sounds with their body music these days, both music and just recorded sounds. And spoken word, and I'm really liking where they're headed with this. When
you say recorded music, what exactly do you mean? Like their
soundscapes or sound effects, other kinds of sounds, as well as music, that they play along with and dance with. It's kind of incorporated into the fabric of the soundscape. Mm-hmm. And so I'm seeing a fair amount of that coming out of Europe these days, which I really, really like.
Very cool. We'll have to check that out.
Yeah. And then the last question is just, what's next on the plate for Keith Terry in 2018 and beyond?
Well, I just came off of just a really, really busy travel year. And I'm home for 6 weeks. This is the longest I've been home in over 4 years. In one stretch. So I'm really concentrating on just kind of lowering my RPM for a minute, because I feel like I've been really kind of moving fast. So I'm practicing, and I'm practicing drums, I'm practicing bass, I'm practicing body music, and I'm doing that every day, and trying to catch up in the office and house projects, house repairs and all those things that get delayed when you're traveling so much. So I'm kind of doing that. And then I hit the road in mid-February, and the rest of the year I'll be traveling a lot. We're doing our International Body Music Festival, the 10th anniversary in Ghana this year. So that's a really big one. Yeah. And so excited that we are going there. And it's interesting, there's not a lot of indigenous body music there. So what we're approaching into this festival in a couple of ways. One is to take the incredible wealth of rhythmic music there, and we'll actually study with Ghanaian musicians in the morning. In the afternoon, we'll be translating all these rhythms to the body and how to translate these traditional rhythms to body music, as we'll be concentrating on that. And then something that has happened in other body music festivals, where we're particularly like I'm thinking like in Brazil and Turkey, in Indonesia, when we go in and the younger generation sees what these artists are doing, within about a year, there's like a wildfire of the next generation that takes off in body music. So we're looking forward to impacting in that way too.
Awesome. Well, Keith, you are a true wealth of knowledge on body music, and there's so much more that could be talked about, but we'll leave references to everything that we talked about in the show notes, so you can check out all of Keith's stuff. Keith, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks for inviting me. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Of course. Hopefully we can collide body music and acapella a little bit in the coming years too.
Let's do it.
And we hope that you will join us next week for a new episode of Head Voices.
Without you.